Elara Croft believed her life was a book that had been read, judged wanting, and placed permanently back on the shelf. At 26, she was a fixture in her family home, as much a part of the forgotten furniture as the dusty pianoforte in the corner of the morning room that no one ever played. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her small upstairs bedroom, its window overlooking a tangled, unloved section of the garden. Here she cultivated her one private rebellion, the precise and delicate rendering of plants on paper. She was a cartographer of petals and leaves, mapping a world far more vibrant than her own. Today, her pencil traced the ethereal, almost spectral form of a ghost orchid. It was a flower that thrived in shade, a strange, leafless beauty that seemed to float in the gloom. She understood it. Its existence was a quiet defiance, a loveliness that did not need the sun's approval. Below, the house was a hive of frantic energy. Dust cloths flew, silver was being polished with a vengeance, and her mother's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the air. The Duke of Blackwood was coming. Elara was not expected to be part of the presentation. Her mother, Lady Croft, had made that exquisitely clear 2 days prior. Clara is at her peak, she had declared, her eyes sweeping over Elara with a familiar, weary disappointment. We cannot afford any distractions. You will remain upstairs. Plead a headache if anyone should be so foolish as to ask. Elara had simply nodded. It was easier than arguing. She was the family's first failed venture into the marriage market, a product returned for its plain packaging. Clara, 7 years her junior, was the new, gleaming addition, all vibrant colour and flawless binding. A familiar resignation settled over her, heavy as a damp cloak. She felt the dull ache of being erased from her own family's narrative. From her window she saw the carriage arrive, a severe black-lacquered vehicle pulled by 2 magnificent black horses. A footman sprang down, and the door opened. The Duke of Blackwood descended. He was not handsome in the way of the young dandies who populated the local assemblies. He was tall and broad, dressed in impeccable but stark black, his presence radiating an aura of immense, unyielding power. He moved with a purpose that made the world seem to rearrange itself around him. As he glanced up towards the house, a trick of the light caught a detail she had not expected. A faint, silvery scar cut vertically through his left eyebrow, giving his stern face a permanently questioning, almost piratical air. She watched as her father, Sir Reginald, hurried out to greet him, his posture a study in nervous deference. Her mother and Clara would be waiting in the parlour, arranged like a perfect tableau. Clara, in a gown the colour of a spring sky, would be the centrepiece. Elara smoothed the paper of her drawing, her fingers tracing the orchid's delicate form. She was up here, with the ghosts. It was where she belonged. The silence from downstairs stretched on. Elara imagined the scene, the polite greetings, the offer of tea, her mother's carefully crafted praise of Clara's many accomplishments. Accomplishments Elara knew were mostly fabricated or exaggerated. She dipped her finest brush in a pot of white ink, preparing to add the final, luminous highlight to the orchid's lip. Then a faint sound drifted up the stairs, a voice, low and resonant, that carried an unmistakable note of command. It was followed by her mother's lighter, more flustered tones. A few minutes later, the pattern repeated. The same deep voice, this time with an edge of impatience. A door opened and closed. Heavy footsteps sounded in the hall below. Elara's breath caught. Something was wrong. The tableau had been disturbed. She heard her mother's frantic whisper to a maid, and then quick, light footsteps ascending the stairs. A hesitant knock came at her door. It was Bess. her personal maid, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Miss Elara," she whispered, slipping inside and closing the door behind her. "Lady Croft sent me. You are to come down to the parlour." Elara stared at her, the fine-tipped brush hovering over the paper. "My mother sent you?" "Are you certain?" "Yes, Miss the Duke. He asked for you." Bess's voice dropped even lower, as if sharing a scandalous secret. "He asked for you by name." "Twice." The brush fell from Elara's numb fingers, leaving a small, irregular white blot on the page. Ruined, a sudden, sharp chill traced its way down her spine. The Duke of Blackwood had asked for her, for the forgotten daughter, for the ghost in the attic. The carefully constructed piece of her small world shattered like glass. Her mother met her at the bottom of the stairs, her face a mask of polite fury. Her smile was a thin, brittle thing, but her eyes glittered with rage. "Elara, dear," she hissed, her fingers digging into Elara's arm like talons. "The Duke has made a most peculiar request. Do try not to say anything foolish. A simple curtsy and a few pleasantries will suffice. He is merely being polite." She steered Elara towards the parlour door, a prisoner being led to her arraignment. The air in the parlour was thick with tension. Her father stood awkwardly by the mantelpiece, looking anywhere but at her. Clara sat on the sofa, her perfect posture rigid, her lovely face marred by a pout of confusion and indignation. And in the centre of the room, standing with an immovable stillness, was the Duke of Blackwood. He turned as she entered. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, met hers. They were not cold, as she had expected, but intensely focused, as if he were a naturalist observing a rare specimen. His gaze was so direct it felt like a physical touch. She saw the faint scar over his eye more clearly now, and noticed for the first time that the fingers of his right hand were faintly but permanently stained with dark ink. "Miss Croft," he said. His voice was the one she had heard from upstairs, a deep baritone that held no room for pleasantries. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Elara sank into a curtsy, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt plain and unprepared in her simple grey-day dress, her hair hastily pinned. She was a sparrow beside a bird of paradise. "Your Grace," she murmured to the floorboards. "Please, rise." He waited until she had straightened before continuing. He did not look at her mother or her sister. His attention was entirely, unnervingly, on her. "I will not waste your time with protracted ceremony, Miss Croft. I have come here today to make you a proposition." Lady Croft made a small, strangled sound. "Your Grace, perhaps my daughter Clara." The Duke held up a hand, and the interruption died in her throat. "My business is with Miss Elara Croft," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned his gaze back to Elara. "I am in need of a duchess, a woman of intelligence, quiet dignity and discretion. I have made inquiries, I have observed. You, Miss Croft, possess these qualities. I am therefore offering you the position." Elara's mind went utterly blank. The words made no sense. It was like hearing a complex equation read aloud in a foreign language. The position. He spoke of it as if it were a role for a governess or a housekeeper. "I do not understand, Your Grace," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "It is a marriage of convenience," he clarified, his expression unchanging. "You would be the Duchess of Blackwood. You would have my name, my protection, and a life of financial security far removed from this house. In return, I would have a hostess for my homes and a respectable partner to silence the matchmakers of the ton." Your duties would be light, your personal life would be your own. It is a practical arrangement for our mutual benefit." The room was utterly silent. The ticking of the mantel clock sounded like hammer blows. A marriage of convenience, to the most powerful, eligible peer in the country, offered to her. The invisible daughter. It was absurd, a dream, a nightmare. She looked from the Duke's implacable face to her mother's, which was a storm of disbelief and fury. She saw Clara's dawning horror, and in that moment, seeing their shock, a tiny, unfamiliar spark ignited within her. It was the spark of possibility, an escape. He was offering her a key to a cage she had long since stopped rattling the bars of. Her own life, he had said. The words echoed in her mind. Her own life. She had not had one of those in years. "Why me?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. It was a foolish, artless thing to ask. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes. "Because you do not flutter and fawn, Miss Croft. Because you have a mind of your own, even if you have been discouraged from using it. And because," he added, with a slight, almost imperceptible softening of his tone, "I believe you will understand the terms of the arrangement perfectly." He was offering her a business transaction. He was not offering love or passion or any of the things girls like Clara dreamed of. He was offering her freedom, bound in a contract. She looked at her mother's face, at the possessive fury there, and then back at the Duke. His offer was cold, yes, but it was also honest. In her life, honesty had been a rarer commodity than kindness. She lifted her chin. "I accept your proposition, Your Grace." The first weeks of their engagement, and the subsequent marriage that followed with breathtaking speed, were a study in formal distance. Elara found herself the Duchess of Blackwood, the mistress of a grand, silent estate that seemed to hold its breath around its master. The Duke, Alistair, as he had stiffly invited her to call him in private, was a man of unyielding routine. He spent his days locked in his study, emerging only for their tense, almost silent meals in a dining room that could have seated 50. He was not unkind, he was simply absent. He had fulfilled his side of the bargain to the letter. He had given her a suite of rooms far grander than any she had ever imagined, a personal maid, and a generous allowance. On their first day at Blackwood Manor, he had led her to a sun-filled room on the second floor, lined with empty shelves. "This will be your study," he had said. "You may furnish it as you see fit. Whatever you require for your pursuits, you need only ask." It was in this room that she began to reconstruct a semblance of her old life, unpacking her portfolios of drawings. As she laid out her illustration of the ghost orchid, the one marred by the blot of white ink from that fateful day, she felt a pang of dislocation. She was a duchess now, but she still felt like the same overlooked girl, only in a much larger, more opulent room. Their conversations were stilted, confined to polite inquiries about her day or discussions of the weather. He was an impenetrable fortress, and she had no idea how to breach the walls. She felt like a guest in his home, a well-treated stranger who shared his name. The loneliness was a different flavour from what she had known before, a grand, echoing loneliness instead of a small, cramped one. One evening, he entered her new study without knocking. She was at her desk, engrossed in a detailed sketch of a fern frond she had found on the estate grounds. She looked up, startled, her heart giving a little jump. It was the first time he had sought her out in her own space. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room. Her drawings were pinned to a large corkboard, and her papers and inks were spread across the desk. He walked over to the board, his eyes scanning her work. She held her breath, expecting a dismissive comment, a polite but uninterested nod. It was what she was used to. His eyes, however, lingered on the drawing of the ghost orchid. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. His face was unreadable, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. She saw him clench and unclench his ink-stained right hand. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and significant. He was not looking at it as a simple drawing. He was looking at it as if it were a memory, or a word he could not quite recall. Without a word, he turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. The encounter left Alara deeply unsettled. It was the first crack in his marble facade. He had seen something in her art, something that had touched him. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a flicker of genuine curiosity about the man she had married. Who was Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood? What secrets lay behind those fortress walls? Her mother, predictably, had not accepted the situation with grace. Lady Croft's fury had curdled into a venomous campaign of whispers and innuendo. Letters arrived from old family acquaintances, full of thinly veiled pity and probing questions. Alara learned, through these back channels, that her mother was painting her as a conniving, slightly unhinged spinster who had somehow bewitched the great Duke of Blackwood. She spoke of Alara's strange obsessions and reclusive nature as if they were symptoms of a deep-seated malady. The attacks were hurtful, but they were also familiar. It was the same weapon her mother had always used against her, the insinuation that her quiet, intellectual nature was a form of madness. What was new, however, was the strange, almost imperceptible way Alistair began to shield her from it. They were attending a small, formal dinner at a neighbouring estate. It was Alara's first major social outing as a duchess, and she felt a nervous dread coiling in her stomach. As they were about to go into dinner, a woman with a rapier-sharp smile, a known gossip named Lady Danbury, cornered her. "Your Grace," the woman began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we were all so surprised by your whirlwind marriage. Your dear mother was just telling me how delicate your nerves have always been. It must be such a strain, taking on these immense new duties." The insult was clear, wrapped in a veneer of concern. Alara felt the blood rush to her cheeks. Before she could stammer a reply, Alistair, who had been speaking to their host, appeared at her side. He did not address Lady Danbury directly. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on the small of Alara's back. "My wife's constitution is far stronger than you imagine," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable chill. "She has a resilience that many, who live their lives in the full glare of society, might find they lack." He then guided Alara away, leaving Lady Danbury with her mouth slightly agape. It was a small act, but it resonated deeply within Alara. He had defended her. He had called her his wife, and the word, for the first time, had felt real. Later that evening, as their carriage rumbled home through the darkness, the silence between them was different. It was no longer empty, but filled with an unspoken current. A week later, a more direct threat emerged. A letter arrived from her mother's solicitor, addressed to the Duke. Alistair read it in his study and summoned Alara with a grim expression on his face. He handed her the letter. It was a vile, cunning document, suggesting that Alara had not been of sound mind when she agreed to the marriage. It cited her history of melancholic episodes and obsessive artistic pursuits as evidence of her supposed incapacity, and hinted that her family was deeply concerned and considering legal action to have the union annulled. "She is trying to have you declared incompetent," Alistair said, his voice tight with a cold rage that seemed to vibrate in the air. She wants to undo this. Elara read the words, and a wave of nausea washed over her. It was the ultimate betrayal. Her own mother, trying to use her passion, the one true thing she possessed, as a weapon to have her locked away or declared a lunatic. But then, a different feeling rose up, hot and sharp. Anger. A pure, cleansing anger she had rarely allowed herself to feel. She looked up from the letter, not at Alistair, but at the wall where a framed map of the county hung. She will not succeed, Elara said, her voice shaking but firm. She was done being a victim of her mother's ambition. She was the Duchess of Blackwood now. She had power, whether she felt like it or not. This is not just an attack on me, it is an attack on you, Your Grace, on your judgment. She took a steadying breath and faced him. At the dinner last week, she began, her thoughts racing. Lady Danbury mentioned her son's recent commission in the army. I happen to know from my father's old letters that her husband bought that commission at great expense after the boy was sent down from Oxford for cheating. Lady Danbury presents a flawless family to the world, but the facade is paper thin. My mother's facade is just as fragile. Alistair watched her, his expression intense. He had expected tears or fear. He had not expected strategy. I will not hide, Elara continued, a new and unfamiliar resolve hardening her voice. We will host a ball, here at Blackwood. We will invite everyone, especially my mother and her circle of gossips. I will not be the madwoman in the attic, I will be the Duchess of Blackwood in her own home, and I will face them myself. It was a declaration of war, and for the first time she saw a look of genuine, undisguised admiration in her husband's eyes. The weeks leading up to the ball were a blur of activity, but beneath the surface, a quiet change was occurring between Elara and Alistair. In planning the event, they were forced into a partnership. They spoke of guest lists, menus, and music. The formal distance between them began to erode, replaced by a shared purpose. He would find her in her study not with a specific question, but simply to sit for a few minutes in silence while she worked. Watching the swift, sure movements of her hand, one rainy afternoon, emboldened by their new, fragile alliance, she finally asked the question that had haunted her since the day he had walked into her family's parlour. They were in the main library, a vast, two-storey room filled with the scent of old leather and paper. Alistair was at a large table, examining estate ledgers, his brow furrowed in concentration. The ink stains on his fingers seemed darker than usual. Alistair, she began, her voice soft. He looked up, his expression guarded but attentive. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He leaned back in his chair, his blue eyes fixed on her. Ask. Why me? She said again, the same question she had asked on that first day, but this time it held a different weight. You told me it was because I was quiet and discreet. But that isn't the whole truth, is it? There are hundreds of quiet women in England. You chose me, specifically. You asked for me by name. How did you even know my name? Why did you truly choose the one daughter no one wanted? He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the rain lashing against the tall, arched windows. He looked down at the ledger, at the neat columns of figures, then back up at her. The fortress walls around him seemed to crumble, not all at once, but stone by painful stone. You are right, he said, his voice low and rough. It was not the whole truth. He stood up and gestured for her to follow him. Come with me. It is better if I show you. He led her from the library down a long, unused corridor in the west wing of the manor. At the very end was a heavy oak door with a tarnished brass lock. He pulled a key from his waistcoat pocket, a key she had never seen before, and turned it. The lock protested with a rusty groan. The door swung inward, releasing a wave of cool, humid air that smelled of damp earth and faint, spectral perfume. She stepped inside, and her breath caught in her throat. They were in a magnificent glasshouse, a cathedral of glass and iron, now fallen into a state of beautiful decay. Ivy crept up the panes, and moss grew thick on the flagstones. But it was not abandoned. All through the space, on tiered benches and in terracotta pots, was a collection of rare and exotic plants, struggling but defiantly alive. And there, in a shaded, humid corner, was a collection of ghost orchids, their strange white blossoms glowing in the gloom. It was a secret, living museum. "This was my mother's," Alistair said, his voice hollow in the vast space. "She was a botanist, a brilliant one. She was passionate and clever, and the world called her eccentric. My father, he was a man who valued appearances above all else. He saw her passion as an embarrassment, an unsuitable hobby for a duchess." He walked over to a dusty workbench where a leather-bound portfolio lay. He opened it. Inside were botanical illustrations of breathtaking skill and precision. They were in the same style as Ilara's own, with the same attention to detail, the same delicate touch. He discouraged her, then forbade her from her work. Alistair continued, his back to her. He wanted a perfect, ornamental wife, and he slowly, methodically broke her spirit. When she died, the official cause was a fever, but I know she died of a withered heart. After the funeral, my father locked this place. He wanted to erase the one part of her that was truly her own. Ilara felt a profound, aching sorrow for him and for the woman she had never known. She looked from the drawings to Alistair's rigid back, and she finally understood. "How did you find me?" she whispered. He turned to face her, and his eyes were raw with a grief that was decades old but still fresh. "After my father died, I was drowning in the debts he had left. I worked day and night to restore the estate. One day, in a small print shop in London, I saw an illustration for sale. It was one of yours." He gestured vaguely. "The lady's slipper. You sold them, didn't you, to buy your supplies?" She nodded, unable to speak. Seeing it was like hearing my mother's voice again. The style, the spirit, the love in every line. It was all there. I bought it. Then I bought another. I made inquiries. I found your name. I learned of your circumstances, of how your family kept you hidden, ashamed of your unladylike pursuits. And I saw my father's cruelty playing out all over again, in another house, to another brilliant woman. I could not save my mother, he said, and his voice broke on the last word. I failed to protect her from him, but I swore I would not fail again. Choosing you, it was not a business transaction, Ilara, it was a penance. And it was a promise to give you the freedom, the respect, and the world my mother was denied. He stood before her, stripped of his title, his power, his impenetrable defences. He was just a man, haunted by a past failure, trying to right an old wrong. He had not offered her a marriage of convenience. He had offered her a quiet, desperate act of devotion. He had handed her his most profound vulnerability, his deepest wound, and in that moment Ilara knew that the power in their marriage had irrevocably shifted into her hands. The night of the ball arrived. Blackwood Manor, so long silent, was ablaze with light. Carriages lined the drive, and the sound of music and conversation spilled out into the cool night air. Ilara stood at the top of the grand staircase, Alistair at her side. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, the colour of the sky just before dawn. She was no longer a sparrow. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, and tonight she felt the weight and power of the title settle upon her like a mantle. Her mother and sister arrived late, a calculated entrance designed to draw attention. Lady Croft, dressed in a garish shade of crimson, swept into the hall as if she owned it, her eyes scanning the crowd for allies. She spotted Elara and Alistair and began to make her way towards them, a predatory smile on her face. Elara felt a tremor of her old fear, but then she felt Alistair's hand find hers, his grip firm and steady. But Lady Croft's plan was far more insidious than a public confrontation. A footman discreetly informed Alistair that a matter of urgent family importance required his presence in the library. With a grim look at Elara, he excused himself. A few minutes later, Elara's father, looking pale and miserable, approached her. "Elara, your mother, and the Duke. They request your presence in the library. There is a Dr. Marsden with them." Elara's blood ran cold. This was it, the final move. Her mother had brought in a physician to put the seal on her lies. She walked towards the library, each step a conscious effort of will. She could hear her mother's voice from within, earnest and concerned. A history of delusion, doctor these obsessive drawings, her refusal to engage with society. As her mother, I am gravely concerned for her well-being, and for the Duke, who has been so tragically deceived. She pushed the door open and entered. Her mother sat in a high-backed chair, a picture of maternal anguish. Dr. Marsden, a stern-looking man with spectacles, held a notebook. Her father wrung his hands by the door. And Alistair stood by the window, his back to the room, his posture as rigid as stone. "Ah, Elara dear," Lady Croft said, her voice soft with pity. "We were just discussing your health. Dr. Marsden is here to help." Elara ignored her. She ignored the doctor. Her gaze was fixed on the tense line of her husband's shoulders. She thought of the glass house, of the ghost orchids blooming in the dark, of the vulnerable confession he had laid at her feet. He had tried to save her. Now it was her turn. She walked to the centre of the room, her steps silent on the thick carpet. "My mother believes my passion for the natural world is a sign of madness," she said, her voice not loud, but so clear and resonant that it cut through the cloying atmosphere. "She believes the quiet life I was forced to lead has broken my spirit." She turned to face her mother, her eyes holding none of their former fear. "But you are mistaken. A passion for beauty is not madness, and a quiet life is not an empty one." Then she turned her full attention to Alistair. He had not moved, but she knew he was listening to every word. "The question here is not whether I am fit for this marriage," she declared, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "The question, Your Grace, is whether this marriage is fit for me." Alistair finally turned, his face a mask of astonishment. "You offered me an escape," Elara continued, holding his gaze, speaking to him as if they were the only two people in the world, a gilded cage to save me from a barren one. "But I am not looking for an escape anymore. I am looking for a partner. Your mother's ghost orchids, they bloom in the dark, where no one thinks to look. They do not need an audience. Do you wish for a duchess who is merely displayed in the light, a pretty ornament to satisfy society? Or do you want a partner who understands the value of what grows in the shadows?" She had taken his secret, his vulnerability, and held it up not as a weakness, but as the very foundation of their strength. She was not the project he needed to save. She was his equal, demanding to be seen as such. She was making her choice, on her own terms. The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Croft's mouth hung open, her plan in smoking ruins around her. Dr. Marsden looked utterly bewildered. Alistair crossed the room in 2 long strides. He stopped before her, his blue eyes blazing with an emotion so powerful it made her breath catch. He reached out and took her hand. "You are right," he said, his voice thick and raw. "It was a coward's offer. Forgive me." He then turned a look of pure, glacial fury on her mother and the doctor. "Get out," he commanded, his voice lethally quiet. "Both of you, get out of my house." Now Lady Croft sputtered, but one look at the Duke's face, and she scrambled from her chair, pulling the stunned doctor with her. Her father scurried out after them, closing the door behind him. They were alone. The distant sound of the orchestra was the only sound. Alistair still held her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. He lifted it to his lips and pressed a kiss into her palm, a gesture of such reverence it felt more intimate than any embrace. "Be my partner, Elara," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "Not just my Duchess, my partner, in all things." A tear she hadn't realised she was holding escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of profound, cathartic release. Yes, she breathed. Yes, 1 year later the world had been remade. Blackwood Manor was no longer a silent, echoing mausoleum. It was a home. Light streamed through clean windows, and the scent of beeswax and flowers had replaced the dusty smell of neglect. The great glass house had been fully restored, its ironwork painted a gleaming white, its panes sparkling. It was Elara's sanctuary and Alistair's pride, a living monument to his mother's memory and his wife's passion. Elara's illustrations, once a secret hobby, were now the plates of a celebrated botanical encyclopedia, published to great acclaim under her own name, Elara Beaumont, Duchess of Blackwood. She had found not only freedom and security, but a voice and a purpose that were entirely her own. Her mother, Lady Croft, had found her ambition had a bitter price. Her scheme had become a notorious scandal, her name a byword for malicious folly. Society, which she had so desperately courted, closed its doors to her. She was ruined, exiled to the country to live with the consequences of her own cruelty. Clara had made a respectable but dull marriage to a minor baronet and was rarely spoken of. One bright autumn afternoon, Elara sat on a stool in the glass house, putting the finishing touches on a watercolour of a new hybrid orchid they had cultivated. Alistair stood nearby, not looking over her shoulder, but simply sharing the quiet, sun-drenched space with her. He had been reviewing accounts, and the familiar inkstains were dark on his fingers. Sometimes, after helping him with the ledgers, she found faint smudges on her own hands, a shared mark of their partnership. "The ghost orchids have never bloomed so profusely," he remarked, his voice filled with a quiet contentment that had long since replaced his stern reserve. "My mother would have been happy to see it." Elara looked up from her work, a soft smile touching her lips. She looked at this man, her husband, her partner. His love was not a fiery, poetic thing. It was a quiet, steady force, like the light that nurtured the flowers around them. He had offered her a sanctuary, but she in turn had taught him how to live in it. She would, Elara agreed. She knew that true worth was not something granted by society's approval or a mother's ambition. It was intrinsic, a quiet strength that grew in hidden places. It was a thing to be nurtured, respected, and if one was very lucky, shared. Their love had been patient. It had been quiet. And here, in the light and the warmth, it had finally, beautifully bloomed.